They say the best things in life are free. Clearly, whoever came up with that little piece of wisdom never spent 20 years locked inside a concrete box, surrounded by shark-infested freezing water, with a guard staring down the barrel of a rifle right at their skull. Freedom is rarely free. Sometimes it costs everything you have, and sometimes you have to buy it back with stolen spoons, a broken vacuum cleaner, motor, fake hair, and a whole lot of sheer, absolute madness. If you are the kind of person who enjoys a good story where the odds are worse than winning the lottery while getting struck by lightning, do me a favor. Gently tap that like button, and if you haven't already, slide over and subscribe to the channel. Let's take a little trip to a place where hope went to die, and see how three men managed to resurrect it. Welcome to the Rock. Welcome to Alcatraz. To understand the sheer magnitude of the escape that took place on June 11, 1962, you first have to understand the nightmare that was Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. This was not a rehabilitation center. This was not a place where bad men went to learn how to be good. Alcatraz was a meat grinder for the human soul. Originally a military fortress built in the 1860s during the American Civil War, the island was a jagged piece of rock sitting dead in the center of San Francisco Bay. By 1934, the United States government had transformed it into the ultimate maximum security civilian prison. The goal was simple: take the most dangerous, the most incorrigible, the most escape-prone criminals in the country, put them on an island surrounded by lethal ocean currents, and throw away the key. The guest list read like a who's who of the American underworld. Al Capone, the King of Chicago; Machine Gun Kelly, the notorious bootlegger and kidnapper; Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed Godfather of Harlem; Mickey Cohen, the ruthless Los Angeles mob boss; James Whitey Bulger, the Boston kingpin. But on Alcatraz, these men were nobody. They were stripped of their names, their influence, and their power. They were reduced to simple identification numbers painted onto standard-issue prison uniforms. The physical conditions of the prison were designed to break a man's mind before it broke his body. While a standard federal prison might have one guard for every 12 to 30 inmates, Alcatraz boasted an unprecedented ratio of one guard for every 3 prisoners. There were 12 rigorous headcounts every single day. Privileges were virtually non-existent. You were entitled to food, water, clothing, and basic medical care. Everything else working, reading a book from the library, receiving a letter from your mother, had to be earned through absolute, unquestioning obedience. But the most agonizing torture of Alcatraz in its early years was the rule of silence. For the first few years of its operation as a federal penitentiary, inmates were strictly forbidden from speaking to one another. Not in the dining hall, not in the cell blocks, not in the exercise yard. A man could spend years surrounded by hundreds of other human beings and never hear a conversation. It drove men completely insane. The rule was eventually relaxed by the end of the 1930s. But the psychological damage was already woven into the concrete. What made Alcatraz uniquely cruel was its proximity to normal life. From the barred windows of their tiny, damp cells, the inmates could look out across the freezing waters of the bay and see the glittering skyline of San Francisco. On quiet nights, when the wind blew in from the mainland, they could hear the sounds of laughter from passing yachts. They could smell the sweet scent of roasting coffee and exhaust fumes from the city. Life was happening just a mile and a half away, teasing them, mocking them. It was a constant visual reminder of everything they had lost. It is no wonder that men decided they would rather die trying to leave than live another day on the Rock. Before 1962, there had been 14 recorded escape attempts. They all ended in tragedy, failure, or a watery grave. These bloody precedents laid the groundwork for the ultimate escape, serving as dark lessons for anyone brave enough or crazy enough to try again. Take Joseph Bowers, for example. In 1936, Bowers, a man whose mind was slowly unraveling under the strict isolation of the prison, was assigned to work at the island's incinerator. One morning, he simply snapped. He scrambled up the chain-link fence at the edge of the cliff. The tower guard screamed for him to get down. Bowers ignored him. The guard fired 2 warning shots. Bowers kept climbing. The 3rd shot tore through his body, and he plummeted 50 feet down the jagged rocks into the foaming bay below. The message from the administration was clear: we will not hesitate to kill you. A year later, in 1937, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe decided to test the waters. These two violent bank robbers discovered that the bars in the old tire repair workshop were made of soft iron left over from the military days. Patiently, quietly, they sawed through the metal. On a day blanketed in a heavy, blinding San Francisco fog, they slipped through the window, wrestled a padlock off a perimeter gate, and plunged into the sea. They were carrying makeshift floats fashioned from airtight oil cans. They vanished into the mist. A massive manhunt was launched. The United States Coast Guard scoured the bay, but no bodies were ever found. The authorities claimed the ferocious tide swept them out into the Pacific Ocean, where they drowned, but rumors persisted for decades that they had made it to South America. It was the first spark of hope for the remaining prisoners. Then came the bloodbath of 1946, widely known as the Battle of Alcatraz. Bernard Coy, a bank robber who had literally starved himself for weeks to make his body thin enough to slip between the slightly widened bars of the gun gallery, managed to ambush a guard and steal a small arsenal of weapons. He armed his accomplices, taking multiple guards hostage in an attempt to steal a boat. But the plan failed when they could not find the right key to the recreation yard. Instead of surrendering, Coy and his men chose to fight to the death. The United States Navy had to be called in, shelling the cell house with mortars and grenades. The siege lasted 2 days. 2 guards were murdered, 14 were wounded, and 3 inmates, including Coy, died in a corridor heavily armed and fully accepting of their fate. This was the environment that Frank Lee Morris walked into on January 18, 1960. Frank Morris was not your typical thug. He was a highly intelligent, analytical, and solitary man. Orphaned at the age of 11, he spent his youth bouncing between abusive foster homes and juvenile detention centers. He learned early on that the world was a cold place, and that the only person he could rely on was himself. He was quiet, calculating, and patient. Prison psychological evaluations recorded his IQ at an astonishing 133. He was a genius who specialized in finding the structural weaknesses in every cage they put him in. He had a long history of successful escapes from other federal penitentiaries, which was exactly why he ended up on Alcatraz. But Morris could not pull off the impossible alone. He needed a crew. He found them in 2 brothers from the Deep South, John and Clarence Anglin. The Anglin brothers grew up in a massive family of 14 children. Born in Georgia and raised in Florida, they knew poverty intimately. Their parents worked tirelessly in the fields, but there was never enough money. The boys were bullied relentlessly at school for wearing worn-out, heavily patched clothes. To escape the torment of their classmates, they skipped school and spent their days swimming in the local lakes. They were incredibly strong swimmers, famous in their hometown for daring each other to swim in freezing, icy water during the winter, just to see who could last the longest. They had no idea that this childhood game was secretly training them for the most important night of their lives. Eventually, the boys turned to petty theft, which escalated to robbing a bank in Alabama. They made off with $18,000, but were quickly caught. Like Morris, they had a habit of trying to break out of federal prisons in Atlanta and Leavenworth. And like Morris, their punishment was a one-way ticket to Alcatraz. The final member of the conspiracy was Allen West, a volatile, arrogant, and aggressive car thief who had been on Alcatraz since 1954. West was actually the one who first noticed the architectural flaw that would make the escape possible. While painting the ceiling above, B-Block West discovered that the old ventilation shafts leading to the roof were essentially unguarded and covered only by an old rusted iron grill. The 4 men had known each other from their previous stints in the Atlanta penitentiary. By the summer of 1961, fate or administrative oversight placed all 4 of them in adjacent cells in B-Block. John Anglin was in cell 150 West in 152, Clarence in 154, and Morris just a few feet away in 138. The plan they formulated was a masterpiece of criminal engineering. It required absolute discipline, unwavering patience, and nerves of steel. They would discuss the logistics every day during the 1 hour they had together in the noisy prison cafeteria. The first obstacle was getting out of their individual cells. Every cell in B-Block had a small ventilation grill measuring about 6 by 9 inches located down near the floor. Behind that grill was a dark, unguarded 3-foot-wide utility corridor full of plumbing pipes that ran the entire length of the cell block and straight up to the roof. To access the corridor, they had to remove the grills and chip away the surrounding concrete to make the holes wide enough to squeeze a human body through. They began stealing spoons from the dining hall. They snapped off the handles and used silver dimes to fashion crude scraping tools. They stole discarded metal saw blades from the prison workshops. They even managed to steal a small motor from a vacuum cleaner, attaching a drill bit to it to bore holes into the concrete. But digging into concrete makes noise. To cover the sound of the scraping, Frank Morris, who was learning to play the accordion, would play loudly during the designated music hour. While Morris squeezed out cheerful tunes, the Anglin brothers were on their hands and knees, grinding away at the thick, damp walls of their cages. They hid their progress by crafting incredibly realistic fake grills out of painted cardboard, sliding them into place whenever the guards walked by. But getting into the utility corridor was only the first step. They needed a way to fool the guards during the night. Alcatraz guards walked past the cells, constantly checking to make sure every inmate was in their bed. If they were missing, the alarm would sound before they ever reached the roof. The solution was brilliant and deeply macabre. They would build fake heads. Clarence Anglin, who worked in the prison barber shop, began secretly sweeping up the hair clippings from other inmates and stuffing them into his pockets. In the dead of night, using a mixture of stolen toilet paper, soap, and concrete dust, they sculpted lifelike human heads. They painted them with flesh-colored paint stolen from the maintenance shop. When placed on a pillow and covered with a blanket with real human hair sticking out from the top, they looked exactly like sleeping men in the dim light of the cell block. The final piece of the puzzle was surviving the freezing, treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay. The water temperature rarely rose above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Even a strong swimmer would succumb to hypothermia in less than 20 minutes. The fierce tides pulling out toward the Pacific Ocean were essentially a death sentence. To combat this, the group began stealing standard-issue military raincoats. Over the course of several months, they managed to hoard over 50 rubberized coats. In the hidden utility corridor above their cells, they set up a secret workshop. Using the intense heat from the prison's exposed steam pipes, they vulcanized the rubber, melting the seams together to construct a massive 6 by 14-foot inflatable raft and individual life vests. They built wooden paddles from scrap lumber. They even fashioned a crude periscope to look over the roof ledges without being seen. The level of coordination required was staggering, and it is highly suspected that they had help from the outside, or at least from the heavy hitters on the inside. Mickey Cohen, the Jewish mob boss, later claimed he respected the boys and kept his mouth shut. There are also strong rumors that Bumpy Johnson, utilizing his vast influence over the African-American inmate population, whose cells faced the utility corridor, ordered his men to stay absolutely silent. The men in those cells could hear the scraping. They could hear the movement in the walls night after night, but out of respect for Bumpy and a shared hatred for the guards, not a single man snitched. By the spring of 1962, everything was ready. The raft was hidden on top of the cell block. The fake heads were perfect. The holes were wide enough. Frank Morris had even requested 2 books from the prison library on how to speak Spanish, fueling rumors that they already had a long-term plan to flee to South America. To prepare their bodies for the freezing bay, the men stopped taking hot showers. They began bathing in freezing cold water. They would soak towels in the icy water of their sinks and drape them over their shoulders while running in place on the concrete floor, hardening their bodies for the agonizing shock of the ocean. On the night of June 11th, 1962, the prison fell quiet. At 9:30 in the evening, the main lights were extinguished. It was time. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers placed the grotesque, lifelike dummy heads onto their pillows. They arranged their blankets to simulate the shape of a sleeping body. Then one by one they slipped through the holes in the wall, pulling the fake cardboard grills shut behind them. They stood in the pitch-black utility corridor waiting for Alan West. But West had made a fatal error. He had used cement to smooth the edges of his hole to hide it from the guards, and the cement had hardened too much. He could not remove his grill. In the suffocating darkness, a desperate whispered conversation took place. Morris and the Anglins tried to help pull the grill from the other side, but it would not budge. Time was running out. Every passing second increased the risk of a guard noticing something wrong. In the criminal world, sentimentality gets you killed. The decision was made. They had to leave West behind. Without looking back, Morris, John, and Clarence began the brutal climb up 30 feet of exposed plumbing pipes. They reached the ceiling of the cell block and approached the main ventilation shaft. Using their makeshift tools, they pried off the heavy iron cover. Suddenly, the cover slipped, slamming onto the roof with a deafening, echoing thud. Down in the cell blocks, the guards froze. But before the guards could investigate, the other inmates, fully aware of what was happening above them, began shouting, banging their cups and causing a massive distraction. The noise covered the sounds of the three fugitives squeezing through the shaft and stepping out into the freezing, foggy night air on the roof of Alcatraz. They moved like shadows across the tar paper roof, avoiding the sweeping beams of the searchlights. They shimmied down a massive cast iron pipe on the side of the building, dropping silently to the ground. They sprinted across the recreation yard, scaling two towering razor-wire-topped perimeter fences. Finally, they reached the rocky shoreline on the northeast edge of the island. The wind was howling. The fog was thick, obscuring the mainland. They inflated their makeshift raincoat raft using a musical concertina they had modified into a bellows. They stripped down, put on their life vests, pushed the raft into the violent, freezing surf of San Francisco Bay, and vanished into the darkness. The next morning, the sun rose over a quiet penitentiary. At the morning head count, a guard walked past Frank Morris's cell. He noticed Morris wasn't standing by the bars as required. The guard shouted his name. No response. Annoyed, the guard unlocked the door, walked inside, and reached out to aggressively shove Morris awake. When his baton struck the pillow, the decapitated fake head rolled off the bed and bounced onto the cold concrete floor. The prison went into absolute lockdown. Sirens wailed, shattering the morning calm. The United States military, the Coast Guard, the FBI, and local police launched one of the most massive, desperate manhunts in American history. Helicopters scoured the bay. Boats dragged the ocean floor. Federal agents interrogated every known associate of the three men. They found almost nothing. A wooden paddle floating near Angel Island, a deflated piece of the raincoat raft, a plastic bag containing a few wet photographs belonging to the Anglin brothers. The official stance of the FBI and the Bureau of Prisons was that the men had undoubtedly drowned. They argued that the water was too cold, the tide was too strong, and the raft was too flimsy. But the evidence pointing to their survival is haunting. A few weeks after the escape, the warden of Alcatraz received a blank postcard in the mail. The only text written on the back was a taunting message. "Ha ha, we made it." It was signed by Frank, John, and Clarence. Clarence's former cellmate claimed he received a similar postcard bearing the prearranged code words, "Gone fishing." A prominent San Francisco lawyer received a terrifying phone call from a man claiming to be John Anglin, demanding she contact the U.S. Marshal's office to set up a meeting, only to hang up and never call back. The Anglin family experienced strange phenomena for decades. Every year on their mother's birthday, a bouquet of red roses was delivered anonymously to her house, completely untraceable, until the day she died in 1973. Relatives received unsigned Christmas cards bearing handwriting that perfectly matched the brothers. When the oldest Anglin brother, Robert, was on his deathbed, his final whispered words to his family were, "I've been with the boys. I know they made it." Perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence emerged years later from a man named Fred Brizzi, a childhood friend of the Anglin brothers who grew up to become a drug smuggler tied to South American cartels. Brizzi claimed that in the 1970s he accidentally ran into John and Clarence living on a rural farm deep in the countryside of Brazil. He presented a photograph taken in 1975 showing two men standing by a dirt road. Decades later, top-tier facial recognition experts analyzed the grainy photo and concluded that it was highly probable the men in the picture were indeed the Anglin brothers. As for Frank Morris, a man claiming to be his cousin, swore he met him in a park in San Diego shortly after the breakout, though Morris's ultimate fate remains the darkest shadow of the mystery. James Whitey Bulger, who had watched the men train for months, never doubted them for a second. He later wrote that they were disciplined, intelligent, and completely prepared to sever all ties with their past to ensure their freedom. They didn't just plan an escape from a building, they planned an escape from their entire existence. Alcatraz closed its doors less than a year later, its reputation as an inescapable fortress forever shattered by three men, a few spoons, and a pile of stolen raincoats. The freezing, violent waters of San Francisco Bay swallowed the three fugitives, leaving behind nothing but ghosts, empty cells, and an unsolved mystery that endures to this day. They had successfully escaped the ultimate physical cage, disappearing into the vast, untraceable wilderness of the world. But on the exact opposite side of the country, beneath the towering, neon-lit skyline of New York City, an entirely different kind of cage was waiting. It was a prison not constructed of reinforced concrete or iron bars, but of blood oaths, hidden wiretaps, and a constant suffocating paranoia. A shadow world where you didn't have to dig through a wall to lose your life. You only had to say the wrong word to the wrong man. Every single morning for 6 agonizing years, Joseph Pistone woke up, dragged himself into a cramped, poorly lit bathroom, stared into the lifeless reflection in the mirror, and asked himself one simple, terrifying question. Is today the day I get a bullet in the back of the head? It was a routine born of pure, unadulterated survival. In 1976, taking on the Cosa Nostra was considered a monumental, almost suicidal challenge. The 5 families of New York City, the Bonanos, the Colombos, the Gambinos, the Genoveses, and the Luccheses, were a multi-billion-dollar empire of blood and extortion. They were widely believed to be untouchable by law enforcement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation realized that traditional tactics were failing. Informants were unreliable, wiretaps were easily avoided, and street-level busts barely made a dent in the armor of the bosses. To tear down the house, they needed someone inside the walls. They needed a ghost. Joseph Pistone was the perfect phantom. He had Sicilian and Calabrian blood running fiercely through his veins. He grew up on the gritty streets of New Jersey, possessing a natural ability to connect with corner hustlers and hardened criminals alike. He understood the rhythm, the slang, and the unspoken rules of the Italian-American underworld. He was chosen to become the first federal agent to deeply infiltrate the American Mafia. To do this, Joseph Pistone had to cease to exist. Every trace of his employment was scrubbed from the federal records. His desk was emptied, his personnel file was locked inside a highly classified vault, and to anyone asking, the Bureau would firmly deny that a man named Joseph Pistone had ever worked for them. He walked out of his office, leaving his wife and 3 young daughters behind, knowing he would not see them for a very long time. In his place stood Donnie Brasco. Donnie Brasco needed a flawless backstory, one that could withstand the paranoid scrutiny of professional murderers. He was established as an orphan, which conveniently prevented anyone from digging into his family tree. He claimed to have spent time operating in the Miami area before moving to New York. Most importantly, his chosen profession was a jewel thief and high-end burglar. This specific skill set was meticulously chosen. A jewel thief operates alone, works quietly, avoids unnecessary violence, and keeps irregular hours. It gave Donnie the perfect excuse to come and go freely, inventing fictitious, highly lucrative scores to explain his pockets full of cash, which was actually supplied by the federal government. His journey into the abyss began not with a dramatic shootout, but with quiet, suffocating patience. For months, Donnie simply existed. He frequented the smoky, dimly lit bars and restaurants in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, places known to be havens for mob-connected fences and low-level associates. One of his primary hunting grounds was Carmelo's, a restaurant owned by members of the Genovese family. He sat at the bar nursing drinks, observing the high-stakes backgammon games where made men casually tossed around $1,000 bets. He slowly integrated himself, losing a few games, strategically buying drinks, and becoming a familiar, non-threatening face. The regulars eventually started calling him Don. The first real breakthrough came through a connection to the Colombo family. Donnie was introduced to Jilly Greca, a connected associate who ran a massive fencing operation out of a quiet storefront in Brooklyn. Jilly's crew was a ragged assembly of thieves, hijackers, and heavy-handed enforcers. Donnie hung around their shop, helping to unload stolen merchandise and occasionally buying stolen goods to build his reputation as an earner. But acceptance in this world was perpetually laced with lethal paranoia. One afternoon, Donnie was driving his car with Guido, Jilly's right-hand man. Guido was a hardened, unpredictable killer who had already taken several lives. As they drove, Guido suddenly tilted his head, listening intently. He complained about a faint squeak coming from the dashboard. Donnie casually dismissed it, but Guido would not let it go. Without warning, Guido pulled out a set of tools and began violently dismantling the car's dashboard right there in the passenger seat. Donnie's heart pounded against his ribs. He knew exactly what Guido was looking for. He was searching for a hidden microphone, a wiretap planted by the police. Had the FBI installed a listening device in that car, Donnie Brasco's mission and his life would have ended instantly in a hail of gunfire. But Donnie had specifically refused to have his vehicle bugged, knowing this exact scenario would inevitably play out. When the dashboard lay in ruins and no wire was found, Guido nonchalantly admitted he just wanted to see if the car was rigged. Donnie erupted in a calculated fit of rage, cursing Guido out, demanding to know if he thought he was a rat. It was a flawless performance, a display of righteous street anger that perfectly masked the cold sweat pooling at the base of his spine. But the ultimate test of his cover came when two senior members of Jilly's crew, Patsy and Frankie, were released from prison. They were highly suspicious of the new guy who had suddenly appeared in their territory. They demanded to know exactly who Donnie was and who could vouch for him. One afternoon, in the back room of the Brooklyn shop, Patsy placed a heavy .32 caliber automatic pistol flat on the table directly in front of Donnie. The room went dead silent. Patsy looked Donnie dead in the eyes and told him that he was not leaving that room until he provided a name, a reference from Miami. If he refused, or if the name did not check out, the only way Donnie was leaving the shop was rolled up in a blood-soaked carpet. This was the razor's edge. Donnie maintained his composure, refusing to show a single ounce of fear. He eventually provided the name of an FBI informant located down in Miami, a man who had been pre-briefed for this exact emergency. Patsy went into the next room to make the phone call. For over 4 agonizing hours, Donnie sat at the table, surrounded by men who were fully prepared to execute him the moment the word was given. He watched them play cards, forcing himself to breathe steadily, knowing his life hung on the slim hope that the informant would pick up the phone and play his part perfectly. Finally, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Patsy returned. The reference checked out. Donnie had survived, but the psychological toll was immense. Realizing that the Colombo crew was not getting him close enough to the highest echelons of the Mafia hierarchy, the Bureau and Donnie pivoted their focus to the Bonanno family. This was where Donnie Brasco truly cemented his legacy. He immersed himself in the neighborhood of Little Italy, running into Anthony Mira. Mira was a terrifying figure, a ruthless hitman with roughly 25 murders to his name. He was unpredictable, violently hot-tempered, and feared even by his own peers. Through Mira, Donnie was introduced to Benjamin Ruggiero, universally known on the streets as Lefty Guns. Lefty was a legend in the Bonanno family. A made man, a prolific killer, and an absolute slave to a severe gambling addiction that kept him perpetually broke. Mira and Lefty instantly despised each other, both viewing the highly lucrative Donnie Brasco as their personal cash cow. The tension boiled until Lefty officially claimed Donnie as his partner, registering him with the Bonanno captains. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted entirely. Lefty became a surrogate father to Donnie, and Donnie became the son Lefty always wanted. But this fatherly love came with a suffocating set of rules. Lefty initiated Donnie's formal schooling in the ancient blood-soaked traditions of La Cosa Nostra. He forced Donnie to shave his mustache, explaining that true wise guys did not wear them. He drilled the absolute importance of respect into his head. To embarrass a made man was to sign your own death warrant. The Mafia was a strict, unyielding hierarchy, where the boss was always right even when he was completely wrong. Lefty taught him the subtle life-or-death nuances of mob vocabulary. When introducing a connected associate, you said, "He is a friend of mine." That meant the man was trusted, but he was not officially initiated. But when introducing a fully inducted member of the Mafia, you said, "He is a friend of ours." That tiny shift in pronouns was the difference between a civilian and a sworn brother of the secret society. The psychological burden deepened when Lefty began preparing Donnie for the ultimate requirement of joining the family, taking a human life. Lefty coldly explained the difference between killing a man over a personal beef and executing a sanctioned contract. A beef was driven by rage, but a contract required the cold, emotionless precision of a machine. You had to look a man in the eyes, a man you might not even know, and extinguish his life simply because the boss ordered it. Donnie sat across from Lefty, nodding, assuring his mentor that he was capable of pulling the trigger while internally calculating how he would navigate a situation where he was ordered to murder someone in cold blood. Over the years, Donnie proved himself an exceptional earner. He facilitated a massive alliance between the Bonanno family and the Milwaukee Mafia, setting up lucrative vending machine rackets. He orchestrated a highly profitable partnership with the Florida crime boss Santo Trafficante, opening the King's Court nightclub in Miami as a massive FBI front to gather irrefutable audio and visual evidence against the top. Leadership. By 1981, Donnie's success had elevated his status so high that he was officially proposed for membership. He was on the verge of becoming a fully made man in the Bonanno family, an unprecedented achievement for an undercover agent. But the underworld was violently unstable. The supreme boss of the family, Carmine Galante, was brutally assassinated in a Brooklyn restaurant, his body left bleeding on the patio with a cigar still clenched between his teeth. The family fractured into two warring factions. On one side was the loyalist faction led by Rusty Rastelli and Donnie's new captain, Dominic Napolitano, universally known as Sonny Black. On the other side was a rebel faction led by three powerful captains, Sonny Red, Philly Lucky, and Big Trin. The tension threatened to tear the New York underworld apart. The conflict reached a terrifying climax in May of 1981. The three rebel captains were lured to a supposed peace meeting in a Brooklyn club. Instead of negotiations, they were met with a storm of gunfire from men hiding in closets. They were slaughtered, their bodies disposed of in a vacant lot. The purge was ruthless, but one target had escaped. Sonny Red's son Bruno had not been at the meeting. A few days after the massacre, Sonny Black summoned Donnie to a quiet bar. The atmosphere was deceptively calm. Sonny looked across the table and handed Donnie a contract. He ordered him to track down Bruno in Miami and execute him. It was a test of loyalty and the final hurdle before Donnie's initiation. This was the absolute breaking point. The FBI realized that their agent was standing on the precipice of a full-blown mafia war, holding a murder contract. If Donnie refused the hit, he would be exposed and murdered by the Bonannos. If he carried it out, he would become a murderer himself. The risk was too astronomical. Despite Donnie's desperate pleas to finish the mission and earn his button, the Bureau pulled the plug. On July 26, 1981, the Donnie Brasco operation was abruptly and permanently terminated. The unmasking was executed with cold, bureaucratic precision. 3 federal agents walked into Sonny Black's club and laid a photograph on the table. It showed Donnie Brasco standing with federal agents. They informed the hardened mafia captain that his most trusted associate, the man he treated like a brother, the man he was preparing to sponsor for membership, was an undercover federal agent. Sonny Black stared at the photograph, his face a mask of complete and utter shock. He vehemently denied it. He told his men that it was a trick, that the FBI had kidnapped Donnie and brainwashed him. For over a week, the Bonanno family frantically searched the country for their missing brother. But Donnie was already gone, relocated with his family to the West Coast, living under heavy guard. When the devastating reality finally set in, the panic within the mafia was absolute. The bosses of the 5 families convened emergency meetings. Photographs of Joseph Pistone were distributed across the underworld, accompanied by a staggering $500,000 bounty. But the ultimate price for the infiltration was paid by the men who had let the ghost through the front door. 17 days after the revelation, Sonny Black received a summons to a meeting he knew he would never return from. He accepted his fate with the stoic resignation of a true gangster. He left his jewelry and the keys to his car with a bartender, walked out the door, and vanished. His body was discovered a year later in a creek riddled with bullets. His hands had been entirely severed off a gruesome, symbolic message from the Commission for violating the sacred rule of introducing a federal agent to made members, effectively letting a rat shake hands with the bosses. Anthony Mira, who had first brought Donnie to Little Italy, was executed by his own family. Lefty Guns Ruggiero was intercepted by the FBI on his way to what would have undoubtedly been his own execution. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, refusing until his final breath to believe that the kid he loved like a son had destroyed his life. Joseph Pistone's testimony decimated the New York Mafia. Over 100 high-ranking members were indicted, crippled by the sheer volume of evidence gathered over 6 years of relentless psychological warfare. The myth of the invincible Cosa Nostra was shattered forever. But to truly understand the tragedy and the triumph of Donnie Brasco, one must look beyond the smoky social clubs and the blood-stained sidewalks of Little Italy. The Mafia believed themselves to be the apex predators of the American landscape. They operated in the shadows, enforcing their will through fear, convinced that their blood oaths and ancient traditions rendered them untouchable. They murdered their rivals, extorted their neighbors, and laughed at the law. They were completely oblivious to the staggering reality that the most destructive and meticulously organized criminal enterprise, capable of dismantling their empire, was not run by wise guys in cheap suits, speaking in coded whispers. It was orchestrated by men wearing government badges thousands of miles away, armed with infinite patience, weaponized deception, and the chilling ability to turn a man into a ghost. Wake up, Grayson. Look at me. Open your eyes. Do you see this cute little glass vial I am holding? Look closely at the small, grainy white pebble inside. That is crack rock cocaine, the most addictive, devastating form of poison ever engineered. You look at it and you think of the glamour drug of the 1980s. You think of disco lights, mirrored tables, and silver straws. But that is the point of this blunt little reminder. It can kill you. And if you have got to die for something, this sure as hell is not it. It is an epidemic, Grayson. A crisis that spread nationwide, condemning an entire generation to death. In just a few short years, it devastated poor neighborhoods, shattered families, and fueled a level of violence that transformed city blocks into war zones. But you know that, do you not? Because it was not an accident. It was orchestrated. You could say it was tolerated in the name of higher interests. The origins of this plague took shape far from American streets in a Central American country with a crucial stake, Nicaragua. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet bloc were at their absolute peak, and from the shadows of this global conflict, your agency orchestrated a covert operation to stop the spread of communism no matter the cost. And that cost meant turning a blind eye to tons of cocaine being imported to finance weapons. Weapons for Central America and cocaine for the United States. A silent, lucrative traffic. We are not going to beat around the bush anymore. Norwin Meneses, the Nicaraguan baron, Danilo Blandon, the liaison, Freeway, Ricky Ross, the crack king of South Central Los Angeles. All roads lead to you. Tell me how it all started. Tell me the truth. The pure and simple truth is rarely pure and never simple. If you want the truth, you have to go back to July of 1979. A dictator sat trembling in his bunker, surrounded on all sides. Anastasio Somoza, the last of a political dynasty that had controlled Nicaragua with an iron fist since 1936. Somoza was Washington's man. Whenever the agency needed backing in Central America, they went to him. In 1954, he helped topple a pro-communist president in Guatemala. In 1961, he provided a secret base for bombing Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion. He even sent Nicaraguan soldiers to fight in Vietnam just to keep Washington happy. But by 1979, the wind had changed. The Sandinista revolutionaries, backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, were at the gates of Managua. Somoza's image was a political liability. His private military, the National Guard, was massacring civilians and torturing dissidents. It was too visible, too dirty. Washington turned its back on him as if all that blood had never been spilled. Somoza felt betrayed, reminding the American ambassador of everything he had done like a loyal soldier. But the decision was already made. On the night of July 17, 1979, Somoza slipped away like a thief in the night. 2 private jets filled with his generals and cronies fled to Florida. Within hours, the National Guard collapsed. The Sandinistas entered the capital without firing a single shot, declaring the end of the dictatorship. But the fall of that regime marked the exact beginning of a covert war financed by cocaine. While the old regime was being buried, Washington was starting to panic about something else entirely. Cocaine from Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru was flooding into the country. At the time, it was an elite indulgence, a chic powder celebrated in movies and music. At $2,500 for 30 grams, it was the drug of the privileged. Politicians ignored the warnings, claiming the powder was not addictive. But thousands of miles south, a different narrative was unfolding. In Peru and Bolivia, a brown sticky paste was being smoked in hand-rolled cigarettes. They called it pasta basica cocoa paste. It was the precursor to crack. It had everything necessary to create a catastrophe. The vapors hit the lungs directly, creating a brutal instant high. It was up to 80% pure cocaine, and it cost next to nothing. The flip side was a savage abyssal depression that set in minutes later, creating a hellish, unbreakable loop of addiction. Ronald Siegel, a respected toxicologist in Los Angeles, sounded the alarm. He discovered that Americans had found a way to take this a step further, turning powdered cocaine into a smokable form by removing the element that made it water-soluble. They called it freebase, Dr. Robert Bike, a Yale professor, warned Congress of an imminent catastrophe. He begged for a nationwide information campaign. The room refused to listen. No budget, no campaign. They dismissed the threat, failing to grasp that this poison was not going to stay in the hills of Lima. It was destined for the streets of America. Meanwhile, a man named Oscar Danilo Blandon arrived in Los Angeles. He was a Nicaraguan exile, the son of a major landowner who had lost his entire fortune to the Sandinista revolution. Forced to start from scratch, he took a job at a small used car lot run by the Torres brothers who were connected to Pablo Escobar. Blandon began reaching out to fellow exiles, dreaming of organizing a resistance to take back his homeland. They formed a group that would eventually become the Contras. The agency watched this taking shape. They sent Enrique Bermudez, a former National Guard colonel trained by the Americans, to organize these scattered exiles into a real fighting force. Bermudez arrived in Los Angeles and tasked Blandon with finding money, vehicles, and logistics for the rebellion. Blandon sent a single pickup truck to Honduras, but a guerrilla war required millions. That was when cocaine became a weapon. Norwin Meneses, the undisputed king of cocaine in Nicaragua and a representative of the Cali Cartel, met with Blandon in Los Angeles. Meneses was a dangerous man with a criminal record a mile long, completely protected by the old Somoza regime. How a known drug baron entered the United States with such ease remains a gaping hole in federal records, though his history of helping intelligence agents cross borders might explain his untouchable status. Meneses laid out a simple, ruthless plan: sell cocaine in Los Angeles to fund the Contra Revolution. In 1980, Ronald Reagan entered the White House. He saw the Sandinistas as a red threat at America's doorstep. He authorized secret plans to weaken the regime, initially allocating a meager $19 million. It was a ridiculous sum to fund a war. The agency took the wheel, overseeing strategy and arms transfers, but the Contras needed supplemental income. By 1981, Meneses was importing 900 kilos of cocaine into the United States, valued at roughly $54 million. Blandon, who initially knew nothing about the drug trade, started selling small quantities to his contacts in the auto industry. Most of the profits were funneled through Meneses to Honduras, but Blandon's operation was moving too slowly. That changed when the cocaine epidemic finally crashed into south-central Los Angeles, finding its perfect catalyst in a teenager named Ricky Donald Ross. Ricky Ross was not destined to be a kingpin. He did not drink, he did not smoke, and he stayed out of gang politics. His passion was tennis. He dreamt of a university scholarship, but there was one insurmountable problem. Ricky could not read or write. With his dreams of college shattered, he dropped out of school. Wandering the poor, suffocating streets of South Central, he was introduced to a vocational teacher named Mr. Fisher, who happened to be involved in the cocaine trade. Fisher showed Ricky a small $50 sample of cocaine. For a desperate kid with no future, it was a lifeline. Ricky and his friends stole a car to finance their first real purchase. They quickly learned the cycle of buying, cutting, and reselling. By 1982, cocaine prices were plummeting due to the massive supply flooding in from Miami. Ricky expanded his network, rapidly applying the same fierce discipline to drug dealing that he had applied to tennis. He reinvested every penny, refusing to use his own product. When his initial suppliers backed out, fate intervened. Blandon, desperate to move larger volumes for the Contras, took over Ricky's supply chain. It was a match made in hell. Blandon provided pure Colombian cocaine at unbeatable prices, and Ricky had the street smarts to move it faster than anyone else in the city. Then came the rocks. Ricky noticed his customers were cooking the powder down into small smokable pebbles using baking soda and water. It was a cheap, raw, simplified version of freebase. Crack had arrived. Initially, people were suspicious of a $20 high, but the intense, instantaneous addiction changed everything. Prepackaged, ready-to-smoke doses democratized the cocaine market. You no longer needed to be rich to destroy your life. The market exploded. Ricky realized that selling retail on street corners was too dangerous and tedious. He pivoted to wholesale selling pre-cooked batches to other dealers at cut-rate prices. He became the first massive crack wholesaler in Los Angeles. With Blandon acting as his exclusive supplier, Ricky was soon moving staggering amounts of cocaine. At their peak in 1984, Blandon was dropping off over 100 kilos a week. Ross was selling it so fast he did not even have time to cook it all into crack. He was fronted millions of dollars worth of product on pure trust. The money was unimaginable. Ricky bought houses, businesses, and a discreet transit location called the Freeway Motor Inn, earning him the legendary moniker Freeway Rick. But the wealth brought unprecedented devastation. Crack tore through South Central like a wildfire. Local neighborhood gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, were transformed into heavily armed multi-state criminal syndicates. The lure of unimaginable profit drove them to expand across the country, spreading crack to Oregon, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Washington. The streets ran red. Working-class families were caught in the crossfire as neighborhoods devolved into war zones. Automatic weapons flooded the streets, and those weapons were supplied by Danilo Blandon. Blandon funneled military-grade assault rifles, submachine guns, and pistols straight from the Contras supply network into the hands of Los Angeles gang members. The irony was suffocating. To fight a communist threat thousands of miles away, the government allowed street gangs to be armed to the teeth, slaughtering each other and innocent bystanders in the process. Informants tried to sound the alarm. Colombian traffickers whispered about an arrangement where planes loaded with weapons flew south and returned north heavy with cocaine, landing at military bases. Barry Seal, a legendary smuggler working as an informant, took staged photographs in Nicaragua to help the White House blame the Sandinistas for the drug trade. But Seal was assassinated by cartel hitmen in 1986, taking his deepest secrets to the grave. The hypocrisy was absolute. In Los Angeles, a detective named Jerry Gateta decided to follow the money. He targeted the Torres brothers, the massive Nicaraguan money launderers working for Blandon. Through relentless surveillance and a brutal ultimatum threatening their families, the brothers confessed. They mapped out a sprawling pipeline of safe houses, millions in hidden cash, and thousands of kilos of cocaine. They exposed Freeway Rick and Danilo Blandon, detailing a protected route stretching from South Central all the way to South America. But Gateta hit a brick wall. Blandon was untouchable, protected by federal backers that local police could not pierce. Frustrated law enforcement formed the Freeway Rick Task Force, a massive multi-jurisdictional unit dedicated solely to tearing down Ricky Ross. They raided his motel, his properties, and his mother's house. The pressure was suffocating. Realizing the street had become a chaotic, oversaturated battlefield of rival gangs, Ricky packed up and moved to Cincinnati in 1988, desperately trying to start a new legitimate life. But the underworld rarely lets its kings retire in peace. In 1992, Danilo Blandon was finally arrested for trafficking. Facing life in prison, he struck a deal with the Drug Enforcement Administration. He became a confidential informant, agreeing to betray his former partners in exchange for a green card and a federal paycheck. His primary target was the man who had made him rich. For months, Blandon hounded Ricky with desperate phone calls, pleading for help, claiming he owed dangerous people money. Ricky resisted, but eventually his loyalty to his old mentor dragged him back into the shadows. In February of 1995, Ricky arrived at a prearranged location to inspect a vehicle loaded with cocaine. The moment he looked inside, the trap snapped shut. Sirens wailed as federal agents swarmed the area. Ricky was thrown to the asphalt, handcuffed and betrayed by the man he considered a brother. He was sentenced to life in prison. Norwin Menezes was arrested in Nicaragua, claiming until the end that he was operating under the protection of a superpower. But Blandon walked free, fully cleared, living comfortably on the government payroll. The truth remained buried until a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist named Gary Webb decided to dig it up. In 1996, Webb published a sprawling investigative series titled Dark Alliance in the San Jose Mercury News. He meticulously documented how a network of traffickers directly linked to the CIA-backed Contras had sparked the crack epidemic that hollowed out Black America. The story exploded. It was one of the first journalistic investigations to go viral on the early internet. Outrage swept the nation. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency was forced to travel to a furious community meeting in Los Angeles, standing before grieving mothers and enraged citizens denying that the agency had deliberately poisoned their children. The pressure forced an internal investigation which eventually admitted that the agency had worked with known drug traffickers and intentionally turned a blind eye to their activities. But the admission came too late to save Gary Webb. Instead of investigating the atrocities committed by the government, the major establishment newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, turned their guns on Webb. They scrutinized his every word, smearing his reputation and discrediting his findings. Isolated, abandoned by his editors, and financially ruined, Gary Webb resigned in disgrace. On December 10, 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his California home. He had suffered 2 distinct gunshot wounds to the head. The coroner officially ruled it a suicide. And that is how the story ends. The Contras never militarily defeated the Sandinistas. The war ended at the ballot box. Ricky Ross rotted in a cell for over a decade before finding early release on a legal technicality. Danilo Blandon vanished into comfortable anonymity. Entire American cities were left scarred. Generations of young men were locked away in the prison industrial complex, and the architects of the nightmare never saw the inside of a courtroom. It was all done in the name of national security. They justified it by claiming the true evil was overseas, completely blind to the fact that they were planting the seeds of destruction in their own backyard. The heavy metal door of the interrogation room slams shut, plunging the space back into a suffocating, echoing silence. The sterile fluorescent light flickers, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. The crack smoke of the 1980s slowly dissipates, but the lingering smell of betrayal and systemic corruption remains permanently etched into the air. Yet long before the federal government decided to play God with the lives of the working class, long before the military-grade assault rifles tore through the palm-lined streets of Los Angeles, there was another kind of war. A war fought not with geopolitical proxies or covert intelligence funds, but with straight razors, raw muscle, and cold, uncompromising intellect. The scene drifts eastward, leaving the smog of California behind, descending into the bustling, jazz-soaked avenues of the 1930s. Here in the heart of the concrete jungle, the streets already belong to a king, a man who did not need a badge to command absolute authority, defending his kingdom piece by piece on a blood-stained chessboard. The concrete pavements of Harlem in the early 20th century were not a place for the weak. You either learned to stand your ground or the streets swallowed you whole. When a 14-year-old boy named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived in New York, he was small for his age, but he carried a quiet, simmering fury that was far larger than his physical frame. Born on October 31st, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, he came from a modest, deeply religious family. His father William earned his living as a fisherman while his mother Margaret worked as a domestic servant. They were a large family of 8 children, and early in his life, Ellsworth experienced the heavy void of his mother's absence when she traveled to New York for seasonal work, taking his 3 oldest sisters with her. He stayed behind with his father and his older brother Willie, seeking a maternal figure in the sisters who remained. Ellsworth was incredibly intelligent, skipping 2 grades in his public school, though ironically he would never officially finish high school. The deep-seated shame of abandoning his education would later drive him to lie, claiming he had attended prestigious academies meant for wealthy black families, a lie his natural charm and intellect made entirely believable. The Deep South and the concrete jungle. Intellect alone could not protect a black family in the segregated, violently racist environment of the Deep South. Ellsworth was highly sensitive to the injustices around him, a reality that crashed through his front door when he was just 10 years old. His 19-year-old brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. In South Carolina, such an accusation was an absolute death sentence, often carried out not by a judge but by a bloodthirsty mob. The Johnson family was intimately aware of the horrific fate of Kit Booker, a young black man who had been brutally lynched in 1904, just 60 kilometers from their home. Booker had been fishing with white men, got into a minor dispute over a $5 fine he could not pay, and was dragged from his jail cell by a mob. They tortured him mercilessly, scalping him, gouging out his eyes, severing his tongue and genitals, before tying him to a grate and drowning him in the river. None of his murderers ever faced justice. Terrified that Willie would meet the same gruesome end, the family smuggled him out of the state to New York, and by 1919, Ellsworth was sent to live with his sister Mabel in Harlem, hoping for a better, safer life. However, the streets of Harlem had their own brutal ecosystem. Ellsworth had a bump on the back of his skull, earning him the lifelong nickname Bumpy. On his very first day walking to school just 2 blocks away from the building, he crossed paths with a gang of teenagers rolling dice on the sidewalk. When Bumpy slowed down to look, a boy named Junie called out to him while another named Six grabbed his arm, demanding to know what Bumpy was hiding in his pocket. Bumpy coldly replied that it was his hand, and if he had to take it out, he would smash it against Six's head. The local boys, amused by the country kid's defiance, started placing bets on the impending fight. A boy named Finley bet on Six, while another named Nat put his money on Bumpy. Six threw the first punch, aiming for Bumpy's chin, but the smaller boy dodged it effortlessly. Bumpy pulled his hand from his pocket and delivered a devastating blow that shattered Six's nose, spraying blood across the pavement. As Six tried to cling to Bumpy's pants, Bumpy mercilessly beat him, eventually knocking him down with a vicious kick between the legs. When Bumpy prepared to deliver a final lethal kick to the fallen boy's head, Nat grabbed his collar, pulling him back. Nat warned him that while he wanted his betting money, he could not let Bumpy kill his friend. Bumpy sneered, threatening to kick all of their asses. That raw display of fearless violence earned their ultimate respect, and Bumpy, Nat, Finley, and Junie became an inseparable crew, forging a friendship that would last until the end of their days. The Queen and the Dutchman. Following that violent introduction, Bumpy never set foot inside a classroom again. Every morning he left his sister Mabel's apartment, ignored her desperate pleas to return to school, and met his new crew on the streets. They started out hustling, shooting craps, playing pool, and selling newspapers to scrape together cash. Eventually, they realized they could make significantly more money by offering protection to local businesses. This caught the attention of Bub Hewlett, one of the most violent and feared thugs in Harlem. Bub was a towering man standing 6'1" who never walked the streets without a knife, a bat, or a gun. He made his living extorting local storefronts, fighting off police and rival Irish gangs. One afternoon, Bub approached a newly opened grocery store on 7th Avenue to demand his usual protection fee, only to be told by the owner that he had already paid someone else. Bub turned to see the 16-year-old Bumpy Johnson leaning casually against Bub's own black Lincoln car. Bub commanded the kid to get off his car, but Bumpy did not flinch, ordering Bub to get off his block. Bub could have easily crushed the teenager, but he was deeply impressed by the kid's sheer audacity. Instead of a beating, Bub offered Bumpy a partnership, officially launching Bumpy's meteoric rise into the upper echelons of the Harlem underworld. In the 1920s, Bumpy and his crew diversified their protection rackets to include clubs, speakeasies, and the highly lucrative illegal lotteries. The numbers game was essentially a lottery for the poor, generating over $50 million annually. For just $1, a gambler picked 3 numbers, hoping to win a $600 payout. For residents barely making $10 to $15 a week, the temptation was impossible to resist. Bumpy's reputation as a ruthless bodyguard caught the eye of the undisputed queen of the numbers game, a French-born gang leader named Stephanie St. Clair. She hired Bumpy to protect one of her operations and was so impressed by his intellect and ferocity that she made him her personal enforcer. Bumpy admired her class, her wealth, and her absolute refusal to back down from a fight. Then came the invasion. By 1933, Prohibition had been repealed, leaving violent bootleggers like Dutch Schultz desperately searching for new sources of revenue. Schultz, a paranoid, sadistic gangster tied to the 5 families, set his sights on Harlem's $50 million numbers racket. Schultz was a monster who killed for pleasure. He once beat a man near death, tied him up, and blindfolded him with a bandage infected with a sexually transmitted disease, deliberately leaving the man permanently blind. Schultz sent his men into Harlem, offering local bankers protection from the police and from kidnappings threats that his own men were actually carrying out. The violent pressure broke many independent operators, but Madame Street, Claire, refused to bow. Her men were beaten, her operations were shot up, but she held her ground, waiting for her most loyal soldier to return. Bumpy had spent 2.5 years in prison for theft. 2 days after his release, he bumped into his old associate, Bub Hewlett, in a local bar. Bub was now working for Schultz and offered Bumpy a guaranteed $200 a week to act as an enforcer for the white mobsters. Bumpy flatly refused. He told Bub that he could never see himself siding with a white man over black people. They shook hands, mutually acknowledging that the next time they met, it would be as enemies. Bumpy went straight to Stephanie St. Clair demanding a war. He wanted to kill the Dutchman and run his crew out of Harlem. He coldly calculated the cost of this war, explaining to St. Clair that it would take at least $2,000 a week to arm men, pay off the police, and cover bail bonds. St. Clair agreed, financing Bumpy's private army. Bumpy gathered his lifelong friends Nat, Junie, and Finley, declaring war on the streets. Junie served as the tactical brain, Bumpy was the grand planner, and Nat was the ruthless executioner. Severely outnumbered, they utilized guerrilla warfare tactics, blending seamlessly into the African-American community of Harlem, a massive advantage against Schultz's white enforcers. The war raged for months, claiming dozens of lives. In April 1933, Bub Hewlett was sent to prison, leaving Ulysses Rollins as Schultz's primary enforcer. The rivalry between Bumpy and Rollins was legendary and blood-soaked. During the summer of 1935, Bumpy was out on a dinner date when Rollins charged at him with a knife. They rolled on the pavement in a vicious struggle. Bumpy eventually stood up, straightened his tie, and left Rollins bleeding on the ground. Bumpy had slashed Rollins so severely that one of Rollins' eyeballs was hanging out of its socket by the ligaments. Unfazed, Bumpy casually announced to his date that he suddenly had a craving for spaghetti and meatballs. Rollins survived, checked himself out of the hospital, covered in bandages, and tracked Bumpy down to a restaurant on 125th Street. Rollins fired his gun, but the bullet only grazed Bumpy's hat, tragically killing an innocent woman behind him. Rollins was arrested, and Bumpy made a silent vow never to wear hats again. The Italian mob and the chess match. Despite winning the street battles, Bumpy knew he had to cut the head off the snake. In late 1934, he approached Lucky Luciano, the powerful boss of the Italian Mafia, seeking his intervention. Luciano coldly refused to step in, stating that if he did, he would take over the entire Harlem gambling operation and put Bumpy on a weekly salary of $1,000. Bumpy boldly threatened Luciano right back, promising to go after him personally if he moved against the independent bankers. Luciano laughed, noting that Dutch Schultz had said the exact same thing. But the dynamic shifted entirely in October 1935 when the Mafia Commission decided Schultz was too unstable and had him assassinated in a New Jersey restaurant. With Schultz dead, the war was won, but the future of Harlem hung in the balance. A week later, Bumpy met with Luciano again. They negotiated a historic treaty. Luciano agreed to leave the independent bankers, who had supported Bumpy, completely alone, though any new lotteries would fall under Mafia control. More importantly, Bumpy demanded to be recognized as Luciano's equal partner in Harlem. No Mafia business would happen north of 110th Street without Bumpy's approval and his cut of the profits. The tension broke when Bumpy noticed a chessboard in Luciano's luxurious suite at the Waldorf Astoria. They sat down to play. Bumpy won the first game, Luciano won the second, and the remaining 2 games ended in a strategic draw. It was a perfect metaphor for their new relationship. A lasting mutual respect was forged between the 2 kings. Bumpy's rule over Harlem was absolute. He was a hero to his people, a man who had stared down the most powerful crime syndicate on earth and forced them to compromise. His reputation was further cemented when both he and Luciano ended up incarcerated at Dannemora prison in the late 1930s. During a yard dispute, Bumpy violently intervened, shoving and beating a man who was attempting to stab Luciano. This act of loyalty secured Bumpy's status forever. When Bumpy returned to Harlem in 1947, the landscape had shifted. Luciano had been deported to Italy, and his underlings, Joe Adonis and Fat Tony Salerno, tried to force Bumpy to run his operations through them. Bumpy refused to bow. He gathered his men armed to the teeth and openly discussed a plan to kidnap the Italian mobsters right on the street. The New York police, listening through a hidden wiretap, could hardly believe their ears. But violence was averted when word reached Luciano in Italy. Remembering the man who had saved his life, Luciano commanded his men to honor the original agreement and give Bumpy whatever he wanted, including a brand new black Cadillac as a peace offering. The ultimate betrayal. Bumpy was untouchable, raking in nearly $60,000 a month. But his greatest vulnerability was his heart. In 1948, he hired a penniless 19-year-old orphan named Flash Walker. Flash was charming, talkative, and quickly became like the son Bumpy never had. The bond was so tight it made Bumpy's own daughters jealous. Bumpy eventually promoted Flash into his inner circle, trusting him to handle sensitive lottery operations. But in 1949, Flash's greed overtook his loyalty. He began secretly cashing stolen checks through Bumpy's bank accounts. When the bank alerted Bumpy to the scam, he returned home furious, only to uncover a much darker betrayal. His 16-year-old daughters tearfully revealed that Flash had been sexually harassing them, grabbing them, and making inappropriate comments in their own home. Bumpy's wrath was apocalyptic. He tracked Flash down on the street, pulled him from his car, and beat him nearly to death. He rained punches down on the young man, his face turning purple with rage, screaming that he would kill him for violating the sanctity of his home. Bumpy left Flash bleeding on the pavement with a final brutal kick to the head, warning him to stay far away. Bumpy's men urged him to finish the job and kill the boy. Knowing that leaving a humiliated enemy alive was a fatal mistake, Bumpy ignored their advice, perhaps holding on to a shred of paternal affection. That mercy cost him his kingdom. Flash conspired with an ex-girlfriend to hide a package of heroin inside Bumpy's sofa and immediately contacted the police. The Narcotics Bureau, eager to take down the Godfather of Harlem, did not care that Bumpy had no involvement in the drug trade. They used the setup to pressure him into naming other dealers. Bumpy refused to turn informant, telling the federal agents to go to hell. In June 1953, despite spending a fortune on his legal defense, an astonishingly fast jury deliberation found him guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years behind bars. The government sent him to the bleakest, most inescapable fortress on earth, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. If you were to open the historical records, perhaps a dossier labeled Prom 4, TXT, you would find that even stripped of his tailored suits and his beloved neighborhood, Bumpy's influence could not be contained. He became the undisputed leader of the African-American population on the Rock. He commanded such immense respect that during the legendary 1962 escape by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, Bumpy allegedly played a crucial role. It is widely rumored that Bumpy used his external mob connections to secure a getaway boat for the fugitives, and more importantly, he ordered every black inmate housed in the cells backing the escape route to maintain absolute unwavering silence while the men chipped away at the concrete night after night. The return of the king. Bumpy Johnson finally returned to the streets of Harlem on parole in 1963. His oldest friend, Junie, picked him up in a 1962 Cadillac Eldorado convertible. As they drove through the neighborhood, the streets erupted in a massive, spontaneous celebration. People threw confetti from their windows, applauding and cheering as if the President of the United States had arrived. Bumpy stood in the passenger seat, tears streaming down his face, waving to the people who had never forgotten their king. But his reign was entering its twilight. His heart, worn down by decades of warfare, prison, and betrayal, was failing. On July 7, 1968, at the age of 62, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson collapsed in a Harlem restaurant, dying of a massive heart attack. The casket of a respected Harlem king is lowered into the ground. But far south, beneath the dense canopy of the Colombian jungle, a different kind of cartel royalty is rising, swapping street honor for billions of dollars and explosive car bombs. The air in the boardroom was impeccably chilled, smelling of polished mahogany, expensive cologne, and freshly brewed Colombian coffee. If you looked around the table, you would not see tattooed thugs or unhinged sicarios waving gold-plated pistols. You would see accountants, economists, and chief executive officers reviewing meticulously prepared financial spreadsheets. But this was not a Fortune 500 company discussing quarterly earnings. This was the executive committee of the Cali Cartel, the most sophisticated, powerful, and lucrative criminal organization in the history of the world. At their absolute peak, these four men controlled 90% of the cocaine flowing into the United States and 80% of the market in Europe. Their annual revenue was an unfathomable $20 billion. They did not operate like a street gang, they operated like a multinational corporation. And their core philosophy was devastatingly simple: why resort to murder when you can simply buy the entire government? Every single year, the Cali Cartel spent roughly $1 billion exclusively on bribes. They owned politicians, police chiefs, military generals, and judges. They were universally known as the Gentlemen of Cali, a title that reflected their quiet, sophisticated veneer, but carefully masked an underlying capacity for absolute brutality. They preferred to negotiate and corrupt, but if you forced their hand, they would annihilate you. The empire was built on the shoulders of four distinct kings. At the very top was Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, universally known as the chess player, for his uncanny ability to always stay 2 steps ahead of his enemies. Born in 1939, Gilberto had dropped out of school at the age of 10 to support his family. By 15, he was delivering medicines for a local pharmacy, learning the ins and outs of the streets. By 25, he owned the pharmacy, but his true ambition required a much darker path. Alongside his younger brother Miguel, a quiet but ruthlessly efficient manager who handled the cartel's sprawling finances, and their childhood friend Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, known as Chepe, they formed a kidnapping ring called Los Chemas. Targeting wealthy diplomats and businessmen, they demanded astronomical ransoms, once securing 12 million pesos, roughly $1 million, in a single job. With the capital secured, their paths crossed with a prominent marijuana trafficker. But the gentleman quickly realized that marijuana was bulky and cheap. Cocaine was the future. Armed with a single kilo, they traveled north, passing directly through the Mexican territories, controlled by formidable smugglers, eventually reaching the streets of New York. What they found was a post-war American society with an insatiable, limitless hunger for white powder. A single kilo sold for $50,000 to $60,000. The profit margins were practically infinite. They immediately pivoted their entire operation. The final pillar of the cartel was Elmer Herrera, known simply as Pacho. Pacho joined the executive committee in 1983. He was the anomaly of the group, highly discreet, financially brilliant, and openly homosexual, a trait fully accepted by the other bosses because of the staggering amounts of money he generated. Pacho revolutionized their logistics, utilizing his deep connections to shift their primary smuggling routes through Mexico, a move that quadrupled their profits. He was also placed in charge of the cartel's security. Despite his quiet demeanor, Pacho was by far the most sadistic member of the boardroom, dealing with his enemies in ways that defied human comprehension. Together, the four kings divided the city of Cali into sovereign territories. They owned the local telephone company, meaning they could tap any line in the city. They employed an army of thousands of taxi drivers who acted as a vast, invisible intelligence network. Anyone entering the city was instantly monitored. They poured their unimaginable wealth into real estate, sparking an economic boom, and bought the beloved America de Cali soccer club, funding a roster that won 5 national championships. To the outside world, they were legitimate, respectable businessmen driving modest Mazdas to avoid attention. For a time, there was enough money for everyone, even their rivals across the mountains in Medellin. In the early 1980s, the two massive cartels actually formed a highly effective alliance. A communist guerrilla group known as M19 had begun kidnapping the relatives of prominent drug lords, demanding massive ransoms. When the sister of the Ochoa brothers from the Medellin cartel was abducted, the underworld united. Cali and Medellin pooled their unimaginable resources to create a private, heavily armed paramilitary death squad named Death to Kidnappers. Backed by wealthy landowners and tacitly ignored by the Central Intelligence Agency, which was happy to see communist insurgents slaughtered, the cartels waged a brief, terrifying war against the guerrillas. M19 was decimated, forced to release their hostages and issue a formal apology. During this golden era, Gilberto Rodriguez and the leaders of Medellin were close friends. They co-owned a Panamanian bank to launder their billions and strategized on how to conquer the European markets together. The peace was lucrative and it should have lasted forever. But the peace did not account for the fragile, towering ego of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. While the gentleman of Cali bought influence quietly from the shadows, Escobar craved the spotlight. In 1982, Escobar successfully ran for the Colombian Congress, dreaming of ruling the country openly. But the political establishment, led by Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla and prominent politician Luis Carlos Galan, publicly exposed Escobar as a criminal and expelled him from the government. Escobar's retaliation was swift and catastrophic. He assassinated the justice minister in 1984, sparking national outrage. The Colombian government responded by signing the one piece of legislation that terrified the cartels more than anything else, the extradition treaty with the United States. The Cali bosses were furious. Escobar's reckless, violent public spectacles were bringing unprecedented police and military heat down on the entire industry. The breaking point arrived in late 1986 during a secret summit. Escobar proposed the formation of a massive super cartel, demanding that he be placed in absolute control. He wanted the authority to approve every single shipment leaving the country, and he demanded a 30% cut of all profits. The Cali bosses politely but firmly refused to kneel. Escobar left the meeting in a blind rage, issuing barely veiled threats. The spark that ignited the powder keg occurred a year later in New York. A minor dispute over a woman between two mid-level traffickers ended in murder. The friends of the victim went to Escobar for justice, and Escobar ordered a hit on the killer. Panicked, the killer reached out to an old cellmate he had served time with in an American federal prison. That cellmate was Pacho Herrera. To protect his friend, Pacho blocked Escobar's hitmen. Escobar viewed this as an unforgivable insult to his supreme authority. He contacted the Cali boardroom demanding they step aside or die. Gilberto tried to negotiate, pleading that a senseless death in Queens could not justify a bloodbath in Colombia. Escobar refused to listen, declaring total war. On January 13, 1988, the Cali cartel struck first. A car packed with dynamite detonated beneath the Monaco building in Medellin, Escobar's personal fortress where his family slept. The blast left a crater 3 meters deep, shattered windows for kilometers, and permanently deafened Escobar's 4-year-old daughter in one ear. Escobar was not home, but his wrath was unleashed. He bombed the Orihuela family's chain of pharmacies, the primary front for their money laundering operations. When Cali sent a squad of 7 elite assassins to Medellin to hunt Escobar, they were captured, chopped into pieces, and sent back in boxes. Realizing that street thugs could not outmuscle Escobar's army of sicarios, the gentlemen of Cali opened their checkbooks. They hired Jorge Salcedo, a brilliant counter-surveillance expert and former friend of the assassinated justice minister. Salcedo, fueled by a desire for revenge, reached out to a commander of British mercenaries named David Tompkins. For a staggering fee of $3 million, the British commandos were brought into the jungle. Equipped with military-grade helicopters painted to match Colombian police units and tasked with a single objective: raid Escobar's sprawling Hacienda Napoles estate and kill him. But the operation was cursed. Flying blind through a violent torrential storm in the Andes, the primary helicopter crashed into the side of a mountain, killing the pilot and severely injuring the mercenaries. The assassination plot collapsed. Escobar, entirely unaware of how close he had come to death, escalated his war against the state. On December 6, 1989, he detonated a truck loaded with half a ton of explosives outside the intelligence headquarters in Bogotá. 52 innocent people were blown to pieces and over 1,000 were injured. 10 months later, Escobar's men targeted Pacho Herrera at a private soccer match. Assassins opened fire on the field with automatic rifles, slaughtering 20 people. Pacho miraculously survived by diving into cover. His vengeance was medieval. When one of the Medellin assassins was captured, Pacho had the man tied between 2 vehicles. For half an hour, the cars slowly drove in opposite directions, stretching the screaming man until his limbs were literally torn from their sockets. The gentlemen of Cali had proven they could be just as savage as the monster they were hunting. By 1991, Escobar's campaign of terror had brought the Colombian government to its knees. In a desperate bid for peace, the government agreed to ban extradition and allowed Escobar to surrender. But the surrender was a farce. Escobar was housed in Alcatraz, a luxurious fortress he built and staffed with his own men. The Cali bosses, refusing to let him rest, devised an audacious plan to bomb the prison from the air, using Salvadoran Mk-82 military bombs. The plot was uncovered when the bombs were intercepted in transit, causing a massive international incident. Fearing for his life and facing a transfer to a real prison, Escobar fled Alcatraz, disappearing into the jungle. This was the moment the Cali cartel dealt the fatal blow. Gilberto conceptualized and funded a massive, heavily armed vigilante group called Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This was an unholy, unprecedented alliance. The Cali cartel provided the intelligence and millions in funding. Ruthless right-wing paramilitaries like the Castano brothers provided the muscle, and the Colombian search bloc, backed by the Central Intelligence Agency and the Drug Enforcement Administration, turned a blind eye while sharing critical surveillance data. Los Pepes systematically dismantled Escobar's empire, murdering his lawyers, his financiers, and his sicarios. Stripped of his money and his protection, Escobar was reduced to a paranoid hunted animal. On December 2, 1993, the search bloc intercepted a fatal phone call Escobar made to his family. He was cornered on a rooftop in a middle-class neighborhood of Medellin and gunned down in the rain. In Cali, the champagne flowed. The Orihuela brothers threw a massive, opulent celebration. With Medellin destroyed, the Cali cartel absorbed their rivals' roots. They now controlled 90% of the global cocaine trade. They were the undisputed kings of the underworld, with a fortune so vast it defied calculation. Believing their wealth and their role in eliminating Escobar made them untouchable. The bosses sought to negotiate a peaceful amnesty with the Colombian government. When the authorities pushed back, the cartel simply bought the highest office in the land. They funneled $6 million into the campaign of Ernesto Samper, effectively purchasing the presidency of Colombia in 1994. They believed they had won the ultimate victory. But the gentlemen of Cali had made a fatal miscalculation. The Cold War was over. The United States no longer needed anti-communist allies in the Colombian underworld. With Escobar dead, the crosshairs of the American government shifted directly onto Cali. Enraged by the cartel's political corruption, the Drug Enforcement Administration leaked the audio tapes of the cartel's campaign bribes, sparking an unprecedented national crisis known as Process 8000. President Samper, desperate to distance himself from the scandal and appease the furious American government, turned the full, terrifying weight of the military against the men who had bought his election. The untouchable empire crumbled with shocking speed. A massive bounty was placed on the heads of the four kings. Safe houses were raided, bank accounts were frozen, and the corrupt infrastructure of Cali was systematically dismantled. On June 9, 1995, a joint force of Colombian police and DEA agents raided an upscale apartment. After an hour of searching, they discovered a secret compartment hidden behind a wall. Inside, cowering in the dark, was Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela, the great chess player. As the officers dragged him out, he pleaded, "Do not kill me, I am a man of peace." The capture triggered a domino effect. Jorge Salcedo, realizing the ship was sinking, secretly contacted the DEA and offered to hand over the rest of the board. Chepe was tracked down and arrested quietly in a Bogota restaurant. Miguel Rodriguez, betrayed by Salcedo, was dragged out of his own safe house. Pacho Herrera, the ruthless financial genius, realized there was nowhere left to run and surrendered to the authorities. The most powerful criminal organization in human history was eradicated not in a blaze of glorious gunfire, but in the quiet, humiliating click of handcuffs. The polished boardroom sits empty. Now the financial spreadsheets collecting dust, the billion-dollar ledgers locked away in federal evidence vaults. It is the ultimate inescapable irony of the underworld. It does not matter if you fight with a straight razor on the concrete pavements of Harlem, if you wear a wiretap in the smoky social clubs of Brooklyn, or if you wear a tailored suit while buying the presidency of a nation. The relentless, violent cycle of power always ends exactly the same way. The empires rise in blood, they thrive in paranoia, and eventually the weight of their own ambition drags them down into the dark. The game is always rigged, and in the end, the house always wins. Fade to black. An examination of organized crime, covert government operations, and high-security penal systems reveals a consistent, overarching reality. Criminal empires and catastrophic social epidemics do not materialize in a vacuum. They are incubated in the negative space left behind by the profound failure of legitimate institutions. When examining the historical narratives of narcotics trafficking, mafia infiltration, and maximum security prison escapes, a pattern of systemic abdication emerges. At multiple junctures, intervention by educational systems, public health sectors, law enforcement agencies, and the judicial branch was entirely possible. Yet through bureaucratic apathy, resource mismanagement, or willful corruption, these institutions failed to act, allowing localized illicit activities to metastasize into generational crises. The foundational failures often begin long before a criminal enterprise is established, taking root in the abdication of educational and social service infrastructure. The trajectory of a criminal often starts at a specific point of institutional neglect. In the early 20th century, the educational system in New York demonstrated a severe lack of truancy, intervention, and psychological support mechanisms. Ellsworth Johnson, a boy who demonstrated exceptional intelligence by skipping 2 grades in a Charleston public school, was allowed to slip entirely through the cracks of the Harlem school system. Following a single violent altercation with neighborhood bullies on his first day of school, Johnson never returned to the classroom. The complete absence of follow-up from school administrators, truant officers, or child welfare services allowed a highly gifted adolescent to abandon his education without consequence, smoothly transitioning into street-level extortion and illegal lotteries. The school system failed to recognize or intervene in the life of a displaced youth who had already been traumatized by the racial terror of the Jim Crow South, where his older brother was forced to flee under the threat of a lynch mob. Decades later, the educational system in Los Angeles exhibited an equally devastating failure in the case of Ricky Ross. Ross was a talented high school tennis player with the potential for a university scholarship. However, the school system had advanced him through multiple grade levels despite the fact that he was completely illiterate. The institution prioritized moving a student through the administrative pipeline over providing fundamental remedial education. When Ross realized his inability to read or write disqualified him from higher education, he dropped out. His legitimate avenues for socioeconomic advancement entirely closed off. If a single educator, counselor, or administrator had intervened to provide literacy support, Ross might never have turned to the illicit economy. Instead, a vocational teacher introduced the desperate teenager to cocaine directly, catalyzing the rise of one of the most prolific narcotics wholesalers in American history. When these vulnerable populations are left exposed by the failure of social safety nets, they become the primary victims of public health catastrophes, which are often exacerbated by legislative negligence. The explosion of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s represents a catastrophic failure of the United States Congress to prioritize domestic public health over foreign policy objectives. Long before the drug decimated American cities, the medical and scientific communities recognized the impending threat. Toxicologists and psychiatrists, including Dr. Ronald Siegel in Los Angeles and Dr. Robert Bike at Yale University, tracked the devastating effects of smokable cocaine paste in South America and witnessed the early emergence of freebase cocaine in the United States. Dr. Bike explicitly warned a congressional hearing about the aggressive, instantaneous addiction caused by this new form of the drug, practically begging the government to fund a nationwide public information and prevention campaign to head off the crisis. This was the critical window for intervention. Congress had the empirical data and the expert testimony required to treat the incoming narcotic as a severe public health emergency. Instead, the legislative branch completely dismissed the medical warnings. They refused to allocate a budget for domestic prevention campaigns, deflecting the conversation to question what the Drug Enforcement Administration was doing to eradicate crops in Bolivia and Peru. By treating a domestic health crisis strictly as a foreign law enforcement issue, the government allowed a cheap, highly addictive substance to flood vulnerable neighborhoods unhindered. The refusal to fund addiction infrastructure and educational campaigns before the epidemic peaked resulted in the destruction of entire communities and the militarization of local street gangs who used the massive profits to purchase automatic weapons. This legislative blindness was compounded by the staggering overreach and extrajudicial actions of the federal intelligence apparatus. The pipeline that supplied the domestic narcotics trade was heavily facilitated by the Central Intelligence Agency, prioritizing geopolitical proxy wars over the rule of law. During the Cold War, the American intelligence community was focused on halting the spread of communism in Central America. When Congress restricted official funding for the Nicaraguan Contras, the intelligence agency turned a blind eye as operatives like Norwin Meneses and Danilo Blandon imported tons of cocaine into the United States to finance the Endivisional Brasco paramilitary rebellion. The intervention point here was internal oversight and interagency accountability. The Central Intelligence Agency bypassed the standard checks and balances of the federal government, essentially sanctioning a transnational drug trafficking network to achieve a foreign policy objective. This geopolitical myopia extended to operations in Colombia. The United States government, alongside Colombian authorities, allowed the formation of a vigilante death squad known as Los Pepes to hunt down Pablo Escobar. This paramilitary group was heavily funded by the Cali Cartel and included violent right-wing mercenaries. By sharing intelligence with and turning a blind eye to the brutal tactics of Los Pepes, state institutions abandoned the judicial process in favor of state-sponsored terrorism. The intelligence community chose to ally with one multi-billion-dollar drug cartel to eliminate another, sacrificing long-term institutional integrity for a short-term tactical assassination. This catastrophic miscalculation allowed the Cali cartel to absorb their rivals' roots and seize control of 90% of the global cocaine market, creating a criminal syndicate far more powerful and deeply entrenched than the LOA, one the government had just destroyed. When intelligence agencies and political bodies operate outside the law, the judicial and law enforcement systems are frequently weaponized, resulting in profound disparities in justice. The federal courts and law enforcement agencies repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to subvert due process to secure convictions or protect protected assets. In the 1950s, narcotics agents arrested Ellsworth Johnson based on the fabricated testimony of an informant who had hidden heroin in Johnson's furniture. The agents knew the informant was unreliable, but they utilized the perjury to leverage Johnson, hoping to force him to name other illicit operators in Harlem. When Johnson refused to cooperate, the judicial system failed to critically examine the tainted evidence. A jury convicted him in a matter of hours, and the court sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. The courts functioned not as an impartial arbiter of truth, but as a rubber stamp for aggressive, manipulative prosecutorial tactics. Decades later, the justice system displayed an equally glaring disparity in the handling of the Los Angeles crack epidemic. Ricky Ross, a street-level wholesaler who had been entirely dependent on his international supplier, was sentenced to life in prison after being caught in a federal sting operation. Meanwhile, Danilo Blandon, the man who had imported tons of foreign cocaine into the United States and supplied Ross with hundreds of kilos a week to fund a foreign war, faced virtually no consequences. Because Blandon agreed to become a confidential informant for the Drug Enforcement Administration and participate in the entrapment of Ross, the federal government rewarded him with a green card and a comfortable salary on the government payroll. The justice system completely inverted the hierarchy of culpability, punishing the domestic distributor with life behind bars while granting immunity and financial compensation to the transnational supplier who had orchestrated the logistics. Even when law enforcement agencies attempted to conduct legitimate long-term investigations, bureaucratic risk aversion frequently sabotaged their efforts. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's handling of the Donnie Brasco operation highlights the rigid administrative bottlenecks that prevent law enforcement from fully dismantling organized crime. Agent Joseph Pistone spent 6 years successfully infiltrating the Bonanno crime family, enduring immense psychological strain to gather unprecedented evidence. He reached the absolute pinnacle of undercover work, positioned to become an officially inducted made member of the Mafia. However, his initiation required him to execute a murder contract. This presented a profound ethical and legal dilemma, but it was also the ultimate intervention point. If the Bureau had possessed the legal framework or the tactical creativity to stage the murder or navigate the initiation, they would have placed a federal agent inside the highest, most secretive echelon of the American Mafia. Instead, the administrative bureaucracy, terrified of the political and legal liability, abruptly terminated the operation. While the investigation yielded numerous convictions, the premature extraction of the agent left the foundational structure of the Mafia Commission intact. The institution's inability to dynamically adapt to the realities of deep-cover operations prevented the total eradication of the syndicate. The failure of institutions is not limited to courts and intelligence agencies. It extends to the physical and administrative architecture of the penal system itself. The federal penitentiary at Alcatraz was designed to be the ultimate inescapable fortress, yet its infrastructure was fundamentally flawed due to government negligence. The Bureau of Prisons utilized a decaying military structure from the 19th century, leaving soft iron window bars in the older industrial buildings. In the main cell blocks, the concrete walls were highly susceptible to moisture and salt air, degrading to the point that inmates could chip away at the walls using nothing more than spoons stolen from the dining hall. The intervention point here was basic facility maintenance and infrastructure auditing. The government failed to modernize the physical barriers of their most critical maximum security installation. Furthermore, the administrative protocols at Alcatraz were shockingly inadequate despite an aggressive guard-to-inmate ratio. Frank Lee Morris and the Anglin brothers spent months executing a massive, noisy construction project directly under the noses of the correctional officers. The inmates managed to steal over 50 military-issue raincoats, a vacuum cleaner motor, saw blades, and paint without triggering a single inventory audit. They utilized the deafening noise of the prison's music hour to mask the sound of grinding concrete, demonstrating a total failure of the guards to monitor anomalous activity. The administration relied so heavily on the oppressive psychological routine of the prison, including the frequent daily head counts, that they developed a terminal complacency. They failed to realize that subjecting men to extreme isolation and sensory deprivation does not rehabilitate them. It strips them of all hope, turning them into desperate, highly calculating adversaries who have absolutely nothing to lose. When domestic institutions fail on a local level, the corruption often scales upward, eventually compromising the sovereignty of entire nations. The Colombian government's interaction with the drug cartels represents the ultimate capitulation of state authority. In the 1990s, the Cali cartel achieved total institutional capture. They recognized that violence was bad for business, so they institutionalized bribery, spending roughly $1 billion annually to purchase the loyalty of police forces, judges, and politicians. The structural failure of Colombia's campaign finance regulations and anti-corruption oversight allowed the cartel to literally buy the presidency. By injecting $6 million into the campaign of Ernesto Samper, the cartel ensured that the highest office in the land was entirely beholden to their criminal enterprise. This capitulation was previously mirrored in the state's handling of Pablo Escobar. Driven to the brink by Escobar's campaign of domestic terrorism, the Colombian government negotiated a surrender that allowed the drug lord to dictate the terms of his own incarceration. The state permitted Escobar to design, build, and staff his own prison known as La Catedral. This was an absolute abdication of the judicial and penal system. The government suspended the rule of law to appease a terrorist, allowing him to continue running his global narcotics empire from inside a facility that the official state police were forbidden from entering. The intervention point was the refusal to negotiate with a domestic terrorist, but the state, weakened by years of institutional decay and violence, chose the path of least resistance. Ultimately, when the educational systems, public health sectors, law enforcement agencies, and sovereign governments fail, the final institutional check is supposed to be the free press. The Fourth Estate exists to investigate corruption and hold the powerful accountable. Yet during the crack cocaine epidemic, the major media institutions displayed a catastrophic failure of journalistic integrity. When investigative reporter Gary Webb published a meticulously documented series exposing the Central Intelligence Agency's complicity in the domestic drug trade, The intervention point for the media was to amplify the investigation and demand congressional hearings. Instead, the establishment press operated as a defensive shield for the federal government. Major publications mobilized not to investigate the intelligence agencies, but to discredit the journalist. They scrutinized Webb's reporting methods, smeared his reputation, and isolated him professionally. By attacking the messenger, the press allowed the institutional corruption to remain obscured and unaccountable. This abdication of journalistic duty destroyed Webb's career, ultimately leading to his tragic death, and ensured that the architects of a policy that devastated millions of American citizens never faced a courtroom. The histories of these cartels, mafias, and prison escapes are not simply tales of criminal genius or unstoppable outlaws. They are detailed records of systemic failure. From the classrooms of Harlem and Los Angeles to the congressional hearing rooms in Washington to the crumbling concrete cells of Alcatraz and the compromised presidential palaces of Colombia, the true enablers of organized crime are the institutions that fail to uphold their mandates. When the state abandons its duty to educate, protect, and govern impartially, the vacuum is invariably filled by those willing to exploit the vulnerable. The cost of these institutional failures is measured not just in stolen dollars or smuggled narcotics, but in devastated communities, shattered generations, and the erosion of the fundamental rule of law.